Thank you very much for having me. As Paul said, I just did a book, which is now out, Swimming with Sharks in English and Unterbanken in Germany, and it will come out across Europe and Asia over the next 18 months, I'm proud to say. The book builds on around 200 interviews with people working in the city on a variety of roles, both within banks and in activities surrounding banks, regulators, credit rating agencies, accountants. And I think what was surprising that when I was sent out by The Guardian to research the city, I was expecting to find a whole pile of books just like the one I've just written. Because you'd expect after 2008 and then the scandals that followed in its wake that there would have been an outburst of research into the very people staffing the financial sector. But there's not. There are rather stupid and sensationalist memoirs with titles like City Boy, Beer and Loathing in the City, or The True Story About My Cocaine Use, and that sort of thing. And then there's The Wolf of Wall Street, and those kind of Wall Street representations. And I think these have created this idea that the banker, there's something called like the banker, and the banker is evil, psychopath, gambling addicted, coke snorting, whoring, fraudster. And the reason we're also unhappy is the banker. It's a bit like the way right-wing people think about Muslims, is the way quite a few left-wing people think about bankers. And when you try to tell right-wing people that actually the story about Islam is slightly more complicated than their hero keeps telling them, Geert Wilders, then they react in pretty much the same way that left-wing people react when you started to tell them that actually the story about banking is slightly more complicated than the idea of fraudsters. As I interviewed people, I began to realize that I'd hit on a gold mine, no pun intended, because if we all had to bleed so badly for what the financial sector caused in 2008 and the following years, and there was almost no research done into the actual people working there, then there must be a great amount of interest among the general public. And this was borne out by the success of the book in Holland. As I did the interviews, I at some point began to attend seminars in the city, and as you meet people on the sidelines of a seminar, you get to ask them questions. And these were veterans, in their 60s. They'd seen the whole thing from Big Bang in 1986 with the deregulation, followed by globalization, the introduction of technology, the coming of the American banks with their practices. And I would ask them, what keeps you awake at night? Because that's my favorite question, at least before going to the bar. They would say, what keeps me awake at night is that the very fundamental law that has governed my entire understanding of economics seems to have gone out of the window. Just like someone who studied theoretical physics, the very first lesson is usually gravity. You drop something, it falls. And the law in economics is you print more money, you get inflation. And so these veterans, they said, I'm working very hard to understand where is the inflation. And so this I found truly worrying when the veterans, not the kind of what the Flemish call tafelspringers, so the table jumpers who go up and say, oh, it's a disgrace, but very calm and collected British public school types who go like, I worry at night and I lie awake at night because I can't make sense of the system anymore. As I began to explore more the monetary aspects of our financial system, I also realized that my book, the book I was writing, was actually basically sitting on a deeper layer. And so my book is about bankers, about how especially bulge brackets, so the biggest universal banks operate, and why they keep producing these scandals as well as the crash. But there's a whole book underneath that book, and that is what this seminar is about, is our monetary system. I'm not really sure to what extent my findings in the city are relevant for what you're here to do. So I would suggest that I keep it quite short, what I have to say, and then I'll turn it over to you. And so you can ask whatever you want to know. I think three things struck me when interviewing bankers, specifically front office. As you know, perhaps know, a bank is divided in the back office, that's support, then the middle office, that's risk and controls. They have to stop the front office from doing crazy things. And then there's a front office doing crazy things. Or, of course, that's not the jargon they use. But that's where the deals are made, the complex products are built and sold. That's where the trading is done. And these three, when I interviewed them, I was struck by just how ignorant most of them were of the monetary system. Because as I was attending these seminars and hearing about veterans that they were lying awake at night over the monetary issues, I would put this to my interviewees, and they would all go like, yeah, well, yeah, that sounds interesting. As if I told them, I don't know, about some fascinating plant in Australia. Or something. It was as if it had nothing to do with their practice. And as I dug deeper into their daily lives, I began to realize that you don't have to understand anything of the monetary system in most roles in finance. These roles are so diverse. This is another thing about the idea of the banker, banksters, is that I think the best way to understand the financial sector through an analogy would be as the Olympic Village. When the Olympic Games are held, you have all these different athletes, and then you've got all the support functions, and you've got all the referees and the doping inspectors, and that all mingles and commingles and is primarily obsessed with each other, not so much with the outside world. And whether you are a top-ranking boxer, or you're a golfer, or you're a member of the volleyball team, or you're in support functions, you're a masseur, or you inspect doping use, these are extremely different roles. They attract different temperaments of people. And so many of them in those roles do not need to know anything about the monetary system. Then I was struck also by just how ignorant they were of the financial system. And I would also, you have to know, in the city there's a code of silence, meaning you can be fired, or you will be fired, for talking to a journalist without authorization from the PR department. And if the PR department gives authorization, the PR department joins the banker for the interview, and you hear nothing. So I had to meet these people clandestinely. In secret, many were very nervous, many cancelled at the very last moment, many begged me afterwards not to publish anything. This big code of silence. And so I would ask, why are you risking your job to talk to a Dutchman who works for The Guardian, the newspaper that invented banker bashing? And they would say, well, actually, you know what, sounds silly, but I really like your project. And when there's so much downtime in my job, and then I read about what the hell my colleagues are doing on the 5th floor, or on the 3rd floor, or from the 1st floor. And of course, you know, as I was listening and somebody was explaining, well, actually what I do is I follow the telecom sector in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Malaysia, and I advise American pension funds on which telecom companies to invest in. That's my job. I fly to Asia all the time. I try to meet these people who work for telecom. I try to meet people who work with them. I meet with my pension fund clients. That's what I do all day. Then you need very little insight into all the things that Jacob de Haan talked about. So they were strikingly ignorant of the financial sector. And then they were also strikingly ignorant of their own bank. And not only not knowing what was happening on the 5th floor, but even about basic stuff, about capital buffers. I think almost everyone I spoke to seemed to believe that a capital buffer, or holding capital, was something you kept separate from your activities. And so in case something blew up, you had sort of money for a rainy day. Whereas capital, as the book by Martin Helweg and Anat Admati, the emperors or the bankers' new clothes, make clear, and it's not very difficult to understand. It's the percentage of outstanding equity in outstanding loans. This was entirely new for most of them. And they, when I would ask them about the crash, they would give me this version, and that version was almost entirely similar or echoed everything I had read myself in The Fool's Gold and The Big Short. And so initially I was thinking, wow, The Fool's Gold by Gillian Tett, an FT anthropologist, and Michael Short, The Big Short, they must be brilliant colleagues because everybody's saying what they're saying. Until I realized that in their jobs they had no exposure. They had no exposure to the crash. And so they took their idea of what had happened in 2008 from the very same books that I was reading. And so the idea of that the financial sector, they're all the same, they're all out there to screw us, and they're all in one activity, has to go out of the window. It doesn't get you any closer to a real understanding of the conflicts of interest that can be found across the sector, and let alone to solutions. Now, what kind of picture emerges of the bank that my interviewees were working for? I think if I have to summarize it in one conclusion, it would be that the idea that it was greed that caused the crash as well as all the scandals is too optimistic. Because greed is usually, I see lots of crisps and I eat all of them. You know, that's greed. Here, when I was listening to people in internal controls, they were describing a bank that had become essentially too big to manage. It was just this vast empire of often 100,000 employees across 6 continents, trillions passing through in all sorts of different currencies, 24/7. And I would have people in group financial reporting, which has to pull the numbers across the bank for the quarterly reports, the yearly reports, saying, look, it's essentially what we do is a legitimizing operation. We go through this ritual of collecting numbers, and once we've collected the numbers and we present them to the outside world says, you must understand the bank because you have all these numbers. But actually, all we do is collect these numbers, and we have essentially no idea anymore because it's become too big and too complex. And if you're a shoe factory and you have 100,000 employees, at least it's shoes you're making. But banks are involved in such wildly diverse activities. And many of these activities, they're run by a tiny number of people, but when it blows up, the damages are immense. There's a really good documentary out called Master of the Universe, where a German investment banker opens up, Rainer Voss. And he says you have to realize that banks are basically inverse pyramids. So the people who can do real damage, they sit at the bottom. And he says, imagine that in Volkswagen, it's impossible for a single employee or 3 employees to lose 5 billion. But in banking, it's quite possible with these new complex instruments. So too big to manage, too complex to manage, and then too toxic to manage. If you can be fired in 5 minutes, which is standard procedure in the city, your horizon becomes 5 minutes. I think the hire and fire culture is a really important and bizarrely under-discussed element of what has happened to finance. And Alan Greenspan, the Fed, your hero, I understand. Alan Greenspan was interviewed after 2008 on how could this happen. And he said, well, there's a flaw there turned out to be a flaw in my understanding of finance. And I had never thought that people would run their own bank into the ground. Now, I think this speaks to the closed mindset that Greenspan must have had, because why would you think of your bank as your bank if you can be out of the door in 5 minutes? In the old days, when Greenspan was looking for his first job, which was a bank, those banks hired often for life. IBM hired for life in the 70s in the US. All of that has gone out of the window in Anglo-America. It's now zero job security. Now, that is terrifying. If you realize that a bank has all these people in risk and controls who should stop bankers from taking excessive risk, but then those people in risk and control can be fired in 5 minutes, it doesn't take a genius to realize that these people are not going to stand up against the risk takers. And they didn't. There are many more reasons for the crash, and a lot of them have nothing to do with the bank. They have to do with politicians, with consumers. But the bank itself, I began to understand over the course of the research, is a blueprint for short-termism. And if you then realize just how important banks are, because if they go bust, they have to be saved, that's really terrifying. I think the most grievous or aggravating conflict of interest is, there are a lot of them, we can talk about it if you're interested in the questions, but I think the most important is the combination of too big to fail and publicly listed. So a quant, who I got to speak to, explained this in really very simple terms. He was a PhD, he had a PhD in nuclear physics, and so he'd started out at university, early 90s, had been hired by his bank, which was by then a partnership. And as you know, a partnership is the partners are the owners, are the managers, are personally liable. So there's a bonus when things go well, There's a malus when things do not go well. When things go well, you buy an extra house. When things do not go well, you lose your house. That was the system, bonus malus. And he described how, coming out of university, he had come up with this brilliant new instrument that he took to the head of trading. He said, look, I've put this thing together, and if we had it 3 years ago and I modeled it, we would have made an X amount of money. And so the head of trading, who was a partner, he looked at the thing and said, wow, that's really clever, Quant. Now go back to your work. And the Quant said, no, you have to see. I mean, this is really lucrative. We could make a lot of money. And it's complex, but I'll explain it again. And the head of trading looked at it again and said, yeah, fantastic. I'm glad we hired you. Now go back to your work. And so after a few more of those exchanges, the partner said, look, it's my money you're fucking with. Now, that is a partnership. And so risk and compliance in that model is the management, Now, compare that to 2005, 2006, when ABN AMRO, which is not a partnership, publicly listed at the time, was offered these fantastic synthetic hybrid CDOs by quants, which looked very lucrative. And of course, they bought as many as they could find. And the reason is that ABN AMRO was taking risks, and when management took the risks and they went well, they could buy an extra house. But if they didn't go well, someone else would lose their house. And that, I think, in a nutshell, and it's actually deeply encouraging because anyone understands this, perverse incentives. If you go to a 7-year-old, I don't know if you have access to a 7-year-old, but I have, and I tested this. Perverse incentives, they understand. You say, half the class don't do their homework, the other half do, and they all get the same grade. What is going to happen? Well, that's basically a bank. And so what is striking is that politicians, mainstream politicians, haven't found the language to explain this. And so instead, we're stuck with these tired stereotypes that do no justice, not only to the people working there, who are actually painfully like you, international, global outlook, highly educated, ambitious, workaholics. They're painfully like you and me, at least like me, but they find themselves in a system that is deeply and structurally perverse, where they come up against massive temptations. And if they don't act on the temptations, their colleague will, and they are in a deeply competitive environment in their own bank. The internal competition is fierce. At the end of the year, there's a cull. The worst performing 3% is let go. And so what do? I mean, here you have this thing. You are allowed to sell it to this silly municipality somewhere in Zutphen. And if you don't do it, your colleague will. And if your colleague and you decide, no, that wouldn't be okay, then your competitor across the road does it. And so I think what we need is better laws, a better system, rather than waving our fist in powerless anger at those bankers who act on temptations. People are people. They will act on temptations. So that, I think, is what I found. Whether it's relevant for what you're after, I think on some levels, that many of those structural conflicts of interest will still be there regardless of the currency we run. In America, mergers and acquisitions, so that's helping a company buy another company or sell another a daughter or buy or restructure, that is a de facto cartel. The rate there, the fee is 7%. And American banks, they divide the market among themselves, they keep out European competitors, and they use their excess profits, not only for bonuses, but also to buy up, for example, the city. And whether you give them coconuts or chips or dollars or Bitcoin, that doesn't matter. These structural, these patterns of conflicts of interest will be there regardless of the underlying currency. I think this is the reason why those bankers are so supremely uninterested. There are, of course, many other activities where what you're doing with Bitcoin and the blockchain is relevant. I didn't really go into this in interviews with the bankers. One, because they seemed so uninterested. Two, this was 2011, 2013, and it just wasn't on my radar. In that sense, I'm like Jacob de Haan. I believe in the division of labor. I focused on one thing, and it wasn't Bitcoin. Yeah, why don't I turn it over to you? So we have some time for questions. Can I throw this? I've been looking forward to this. Now I want to throw. Yeah. Yeah.
Wie was het?
One very simple question. Are you working on a new book?
No. No. You're not a woman, so you never gave birth. But writing a book is like an elephant pregnancy. So,
Okay.
you know, if any women here who have given birth to a child, if say a few hours after the thing has come out and you stick a microphone in to her face and says, "The next child."
I was
boy
always
or girl.
asking about a book.
Yeah. So I need to recover.
Where do I speak here? First of all, Mr. Luyendijk, I want to pay my respects to your work. I think it is very important that we have journalists who speak truth to power. And I want to thank you for that. And now my question. You are very nuanced in your approach in saying that many of the people who work in the city and in the banking sector are actually very normal people, but working in a structural, perverse environment. My question always is then, well, if everybody is just normal people and everybody can see that it's a perverse incentive structure, what would it actually really take for the people in that sector to come out and say, you know, this does not work, this is destructive? What is keeping them from actually acknowledging what everybody already knows?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me rephrase a little bit. I didn't say everyone was normal. I think there's a surprising number of people who are like you and me. But I think banking in its current form does attract a very typical kind of, mostly narcissists in my view, not so much psychopaths, because psychopaths are impulsive, and to make it in a big bank you need to be a conformist. And so if it's 11 o'clock in the evening on Friday and you already told your girlfriend, no, I can't make it to dinner, but we'll see each other in the club, and then as you are on your way out, your boss says, actually, I want you to finish this report before tomorrow morning, so you're going to do an all-nighter, and you know that the report won't even be read by the client. I think this is when a psychopath will manage to get out because he wants to sleep with his girlfriend. But a narcissist will think, you know, my sense of self will not survive the loss of my job, so I will cancel my girlfriend again. So I think it's narcissists who will go very, very far in keeping their status. And then a lot of normal people, you don't need a lot of salt to turn a glass of water into something disgusting. And as you said, what will it take? I think that there's some really good sociological and economical work by Hirschman about exit and voice. So when you don't agree with what's happening in an organization or in your family, or so, human beings essentially have two options. They can speak out or they can leave. And I think this is what's happening, is that if you speak out, you leave because of this code of silence and this code of silence about the code of silence. And I think you'd be surprised how many people have left banking and then went on, say, to the Sustainable Finance Lab in London, and many of them are ex-bankers. And I think for a while they couldn't believe just how awful a lot of things were. Then for a while, I mean, the money was very good. It's difficult to walk away from a few $100,000. It's also difficult to admit to yourself that you've basically thrown away your 20s fighting for a number on a screen. And so it takes quite some psychological strength to get out. Since there's almost no room for voice, then it's exit. And I think the one answer why 200 people would risk their job in meeting with me was that they wanted voice. And so neoclassical economics will tell you that we're all utility maximizing rational human beings. Now, according to that model, nobody should have been prepared to meet with me. But what some of them wanted to defend banking, or they were in this delusional bubble that nothing was really wrong, it was all the fault of politicians, central bankers and consumers. But many said, this is my only opportunity to raise my voice. They also said that they were skeptical whether the general public was really interested in hearing the truth. Because I think once you recognize it's not evil bankers, but it's evil structures, and you zoom out, you you also have to abandon this fantasy of we just need to get rid of those 250,000 evildoers and bring in 250,000 new people and all will be fine. Then I think the next step is also to recognize the degree of complicity, especially among home-owning middle-class people, who, I give these talks to people and I say, okay, so you want an honest and fair and stable financial sector, then housing prices have to go into, I think, 30%. Who is still in favor of a fair and financial sector? And I think not many hands go up. So there seems to be an almost perverse impasse where we blame everything on individual failures among bankers. And this stops us from looking at the structural causes. And it also perpetuates this myth that you can create ever more credit, ever more debt, ever more bubbles, and extract money from those bubbles, feed them back into the economy, call it economic growth, and then justify the economic growth or use more lending by justifying with a growth in your GDP.
Yeah.
Yeah? Yeah. Well, I don't have directly a question, but I have a comment. What you're actually talking about is psychological control in such an organization. And there's a very interesting book written by Dr. Katz de Vries, and the book is called The Neurotic Organization. And he tells in there how the psychopaths in the organization actually control normal human beings and are able to do the things as you just explained.
Mm. Yes, and I've been reading up a lot on psychopaths because outsiders seem to be really tempted by the idea that they are controlling. And I think some elements of finance lend themselves really well to psychopaths because psychopaths find it very difficult to stay with one employer or one social context for a long time. And this is how you can recognize them. By the time they're in their late 30s and they have a new job every 9 months, using superficial charm, they get new jobs, but they always leave because of conflicts they create. And finance, because of the zero job security, allows people to jump jobs and present it as evidence of their talents. However, I think if you compare, if you go online and you compare the evidence given by Rupert Murdoch, the owner of Fox News, who sold people the idea that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11, and you compare it to the testimony by Bob Diamond, who ran Barclays. Now, what Rupert Murdoch does, he sits down and the entire nation is watching him because his newspapers have done absolutely awful things. They do awful things all the time, but this was so awful that even the Brits recognized it as being super awful. So he sits there and he says, "This is the humblest day of my life." And that becomes the headline. And everybody says, "Oh, Rupert, he eats some humble pie." And then Rupert, of course, the next day, it's back to business as usual. Now, that's a psychopath. If you go to Bob Diamond sits there and he has to explain how his traders have fixed one of the most important interest rates in the world, LIBOR. And he sits there and the parliamentarians give him opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to say, "I'm really sorry, this happened under my watch, I get paid millions, I should have done something about this, I failed, and I need to take responsibility." No. The traders disappointed him, and we should all feel really sorry for Bob. Now, that's a narcissist. That's someone who cannot even admit a tiny bit of black in his sense of self. And so I think we look for the narcissists. And they are just as devious and manipulative as the psychopaths.
Yeah, you've gotten a lot of attention with your book and your speeches. Do you now think there's a real chance we can fix this? Because I haven't seen anything in the news or politicians talking about this. But you told me, or everybody else, that politicians would fix this because that's actually the only way we could solve this.
Yeah, I do think that we need better laws. And so since we don't have better laws, we have lots of rules. And those rules actually suffocate banking. And there are elements of banking, the honorable profession. I mean, you do want, if they look at 2, say, wind turbine factories, you do want somebody to go there and work out where management is best. So we can invest our money there and not in the other one. So we need better laws. And if you look at the 30s in America, where the crash was allowed to play out, simply because they couldn't bail out the system, after legislation coming, tough legislation, the Glass-Steagall Act, separating certain activities from one another, and that was just a few pages. And so it was a clear law. Now, if you compare this to the dot-com scandal in the early this century, where it turns out that if you put under one roof in a bank both bankers who take a technology company public, also bankers who invest clients' money into technology firms, and then also traders who trade on behalf of clients in these technology firms, and then also prop traders who use capital of their own bank to speculate, that creates insane conflicts of interest that then create huge bubbles when they burst, wipe out hundreds of billions. What happened is that we didn't have a Glass-Steagall Act of a few pages saying, look, it's very clear that we should never have these activities under one roof, so we're going to force banks to separate, to break them up, which will also increase competition, will make them less big. No, we didn't do this. We said, okay, you can keep all this if you promise a better culture, you're going to have nicer bankers, and we're going to have Chinese walls between these activities. And so they can't take the same lift anymore. And of course that's hopeless, because can they still talk in the cafeteria? Can you talk in the lift? Do you need someone from risk and compliance to sit in the lift to make sure people don't talk? How do you stop them from meeting elsewhere? And so it's a bad law. We didn't break up these activities into the separate firms, and so we bring in insane amounts of rules in order to mitigate the inevitable effects. So better laws, that requires better politicians, or the existing politicians doing better things. And I think that the next step is really for political journalism. As long as political journalists don't pick up this story, there are people in parliament who are aware of all this. I mean, for the Dutch context, people like Pieter Omtzigt, in Belgium, John Combet, they are there, but they are entirely isolated. And everybody knows that the incentive structure for media is just as perverse as it is in banking. So if you call for the abolition of the speed limit, you'll get a lot of attention. But if you call for abolition of a particular conflict of interest in banking, nobody invites you. And it's visibility these days that drives political careers. So it's very hard, and I think the one area where real change could come is if 5 or 6 really dominant people in political journalism, both in Brussels, in London, in The Hague, would decide, actually, we're going to make this a centerpiece of our reporting, and we'll do political journalism, so journalism not about politicians and their popularity, but journalism about politics. And I think there would be a vast audience for this.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.